Hi, everybody. Today is Friday, February 21st, 2025, and our friend Ambassador Chas Freeman is back with us. Welcome back, Ambassador.
Glad to be with you, Nima.
Let's get started. I want to start with what's going on between the United States and Russia and the reflection of what has happened and the way that the reflection of what has happened for Europeans. But before going to that, we had a meeting between the Arab states considering because Donald Trump has a plan for Gaza, and Egypt came up with a new plan on their part. And right now, it seems the Arab states are talking about the plan on the part of Egyptian government. How do you see Donald Trump behavior and its influence on the Arab states and the way that they're behaving right now?
Well, there's a lot to say about that. Obviously, President Trump has alarmed everybody in the Middle East except Israel. He's basically talking from Israeli talking points, plus his real estate experience. So he's come up with this crazy idea of turning the Gaza Strip into a Riviera where there will be no Palestinians. They'll have to leave. They'll go to Egypt. They'll go to Jordan. Jordan and Egypt can't afford to take them. So this is a bit of a dilemma. And the Egyptians, as you mentioned, have come up with a different plan, which is leave the Palestinians in place, rebuild Gaza, of course, make a resort out of it, but a decent place for Palestinians to live, not a Riviera that would be basically turned over to Israel. So we have a lot of contradictions here. It's very clear that Israelis want to evacuate the Palestinians, eliminate them, cleanse them ethnically, empty Gaza, and then settle it with Israelis. And it's very clear that this is not acceptable to anybody in the international community. And Mr. Trump's suggestion would facilitate the Israeli plan. So that is not acceptable to anybody. So we have a lot of squirming going on. For Jordan, the influx of more Palestinian refugees would be catastrophic. It would very likely result in the almost immediate overthrow of the monarchy, the collapse of Jordan as a moderate state, and the inclusion of Jordan in some sort of regional intifada against Israel. Egypt is in a less dangerous situation, perhaps, but Egypt is at a point where it doesn't have the water or the food for its own people. They can't take in more people. And there's also a matter of national pride. Egypt has been humiliated repeatedly by Israel and is totally dependent on the United States. So what Mr. Trump is doing is basically threatening both Cairo and Amman in Jordan, the Jordanian capital, the Kingdom of Jordan, and and Egypt, with the suspension of U.S. assistance. This puts both of them in an impossible position. If they accept Mr. Trump's plan for Gaza, they lose their heads. If they don't accept it, they lose their economic prosperity. So one thing that must have been on the agenda in Riyadh, in addition to talking about the Egyptian plan to facilitate the redevelopment of Gaza with international assistance and participation from the United States, but basically managed by Palestinian labor, must have been one of the issues they must have been talking about is the possible substitution of American aid for aid from others who might provide aid to Jordan. Well, there's a long tradition of Saudi and other Gulf Arab aid to Jordan in the past. This was a tradition that was broken during the first Gulf War when Jordan sided with Iraq, Saddam Hussein, against the Gulf Arab states, the United States, and even Syria, which joined that war on the side of the coalition to liberate Kuwait. There is also a great deal of support traditionally for Egypt. There is a possibility of Russian and Chinese assistance, or maybe even Indian assistance. I'm sure they talked about all these things. But they are in a very bad position, and it's hardly surprising that we have yet to see any concrete result from the deliberations they're conducting.
Do we know why the Trump administration has decided to have the talks on Ukraine in Saudi Arabia? Because that was so much interesting in terms of I don't know if Saudi Arabia is does have Saudi Arabia understands that they can somehow convince the Trump administration to consider what Egypt is talking about. Do you think do they have any sort of leverage on Donald Trump, or maybe some sort of friendship that makes them that can force him in in that direction?
Well, there is, of course, a history in the first Trump administration, a great deal of interaction between the Saudis and Mr. Trump. Mr. Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, who was the architect of the so-called Abraham Accords, is the beneficiary of $2 billion in investment from the Saudi sovereign fund, which he's using apparently to develop a resort in Albania, as well as settlements in Palestine, ironically. So the Trump administration has a historic connection to Saudi Arabia, which the Saudis want to preserve. But from the Saudi point of view, hosting this meeting made a great deal of sense. First of all, of course, it benefited the United States because it wasn't in Europe. The fact that a meeting between Russia and the United States would take place in Saudi Arabia, which is neutral on the issue of Ukraine, was entirely appropriate. But more to the point, the world order is shifting, and middle-ranking powers, among whom we may count Saudi Arabia, as well as Turkey, Iran, others, are now exercise a more independent and influential foreign policy. And Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince, the de facto ruler of Saudi Arabia at the moment, wants very much to put Saudi Arabia on the global diplomatic map. And by hosting this meeting, he gained a bit of prestige. He probably ingratiated both the Russians and the Americans, and he did no harm to the kingdom's interests. So I think this was a convenience for everybody.
With what has happened so far, can we be optimistic about the ceasefire in Gaza, the phases, the first phase and second and the third? Is that possible to achieve it?
No, I don't think there's any ground for optimism. Even if Mr. Netanyahu had not made it clear from the very beginning that he insisted on the right to resume the war of annihilation against the Palestinians whenever he chose, we can see outrageous Israeli violations of the ceasefire in Lebanon, for example, similar violations in Gaza. And now we see really a most disturbing Israeli attack on Hamas for allegedly releasing the corpse of the wrong person, the mother of two infants who were children who were taken on October 7th, and blaming and saying there will be retribution and so forth. The irony of this apparently escapes the Israeli government. There are tens of thousands of Palestinians buried in the rubble of Gaza who have not been identified. How on earth Hamas, hiding in tunnels with constant bombing for 15, 16 months, is supposed to keep track of who has been killed by Israeli bombing when there are many, many dead, is an interesting question. So to jump to the conclusion that this was deliberate on Hamas's part is absolutely absurd. And it demonstrates that Israel is looking for an excuse to resume the genocide.
Ambassador, how do you see the situation in southern Lebanon? Do you think that we know that Israel doesn't want to leave those 5 points that they're occupying right now? Is that going to last? We have tomorrow, we're going to have the funeral of Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah. Are we going to see in the aftermath of this funeral, are we going to see the new clashes, the new fights between Hezbollah and Israelis?
Well, Israel, by insisting on violating the ceasefire and withdrawal agreement, and by holding on to strategic points in Lebanon, in addition to having absolutely devastated Lebanese villages, much as it did in Gaza, has finally brought the Lebanese government into active opposition. The Lebanese government was part of the agreement of the so-called ceasefire. That is, it was supposed to move into southern Lebanon as Hezbollah withdrew, and it was supposed to cooperate with the Israelis in maintaining a border with Israel that was not contested. And Mr. Aoun, the new president of Lebanon, has now aligned himself more with Lebanese nationalism against Israel. So it looks to me as if there will be additional fights, that Israel cannot hold on to these points without paying a high price. And I would note that, the Israeli military, competent as it is in many ways, has been very hard pressed both in Lebanon and in Gaza. Military experts who've looked at what has happened in both arenas have said that basically the Israelis were losing. They were not winning, and they have not been able to achieve their objectives. They have neither removed Hamas from control in Gaza, nor have they decimated the mass of Hezbollah as opposed to its leadership. So the funeral is, of course, a moment of tension, a moment in which a resumption of the fighting might well occur. I wouldn't be surprised if it did. You're muted.
Getting to the conflict in Ukraine, we're witnessing that Donald Trump is changing his tone toward Zelensky, that he's talking about the approval rating of Zelensky to be 4%, and he's not the legitimate president of Ukraine, and so forth and so on. How can we understand the way that Donald Trump is dealing with Zelensky right now? Here is what his Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, was talking about.
Post that President Zelensky is a dictator without elections. What are you thinking?
I think President Trump is very upset at President Zelensky, and in some cases, and rightfully so. Look, number one, Joe Biden had frustrations with Zelensky. People shouldn't forget it. There are newspaper articles out there about how he cursed at him in a phone call because Zelensky, instead of saying thank you for all your help, is immediately out there messaging what we're not doing or what he's not getting. I think the second thing is, frankly, I was personally very upset because we had a conversation with President Zelensky, the vice president and I, three of us. And we discussed this issue about the mineral rights. And we explained to them, look, we want to be in a joint venture with you, not because we're trying to steal from your country, but because we think that's actually a security guarantee. If we're your partner in an important economic endeavor, we get to get paid back some of the money the taxpayers have given, close to $200 billion. And it also, now we have a vested interest in the security of Ukraine. And he said, sure, we want to do this deal. It makes all the sense in the world. The only thing is I need to run it through my legislative process. They have to approve it. I read 2 days later that Zelensky's out there saying, I rejected the deal. I told him, no way, that we're not doing that. Well, that's not what happened in that meeting. So you start to get upset by somebody. We're trying to help these guys. One of the points the president made in his messaging is not that we don't care about Ukraine, but Ukraine is on another continent. You know, it doesn't directly impact the daily lives of Americans. We care about it because it has implications for our allies and ultimately for the world. There should be some level of gratitude here about this. And when you don't see it and you see him out there accusing the president of living in a world of disinformation, that's very counterproductive. And I don't need to explain to you or anybody else, President Trump's not the kind of person that's going to sit there and take that. He's very transparent. He's going to tell you exactly how he feels. And he sent a message that he's not going to get gamed here.
Yeah.
That's very, there are lots of things to say about that. First, obviously, Secretary of State Rubio is doing his job as a loyal defender of the president's policies, whatever he may think himself. That was an effective defense in domestic political terms. I don't think it would be much admired internationally because the essence of it in the end was that Mr. Zelensky is refusing to sell out the mineral resources of his country as a sort of reparations for a war that the United States, Great Britain, and members of NATO convinced him he should conduct. We cannot forget that in March of 2022, he tried to make peace with Russia and was brought up short by Boris Johnson flying into Kiev and advising him not to sign the treaty that he had his representatives initial. So that's the first part of it. The second part is, of course, Mr. Trump doesn't like Mr. Zelensky. His relationship with Mr. Zelensky and dealings with him were the subject of an impeachment effort during his first term in office. And Mr. Trump, what everyone else says about him, is somebody who is vengeful. So his predisposition, despite his statements that he likes Mr. Zelensky, which I think are disingenuous, has been to punish Zelensky. Third, the United States, that is to say, the Trump administration and the Trump campaign and the people around Trump have made no secret of their desire to ditch Ukraine in this war. They have considered this to be a foolish endeavor on the part of the United States. Some of them believe that it has prevented a sort of reverse Richard Nixon opening to China with Russia. They want to have a geopolitical cooperation with Russia against China, which I don't think will work, but that was a theme in the meeting in Riyadh with the Russians, clearly. So there is an incentive here to distance the United States from Ukraine. And Mr. Trump has a record of personal diatribe and vilification of people he does not agree with, making up nicknames for them that are pejorative and demeaning. And he's doing the same thing with Mr. Zelensky. So now Zelensky finally is in a very difficult position. He is trying to save his own government. He is not currently in office constitutionally. The war led him to suspend elections and continue in office. This has been an issue between Ukraine and Russia because Vladimir Putin has said, well, he has no legitimacy, therefore I should not talk to him. Sometimes he said, well, I will talk to him if that's what's necessary to end the war. But in effect, Mr. Trump agrees with Vladimir Putin. Now, a final point on that, of course, is that if Mr. Trump is right in what he says, that Vladimir Zelensky does not have political legitimacy in Ukraine, that his popularity is low, and that he cannot speak for Ukraine, the fact that Vladimir Putin agrees with that, it does not make it wrong. In other words, if I say something that's right, and someone who's the wrong person says they agree with me, that doesn't make what I said wrong. So that's a fundamental point. But this is clearly a mess. This is not how to conduct diplomacy, either from Kyiv or from Washington. It must delight Moscow because it is very injurious to the prospects for the kind of Ukraine we would all like to see, which is a bridge and a buffer between Russia and the rest of Europe, and a Ukraine that is neutral, that is democratic, and that prospers by connecting itself to both the East and the West.
How did you find the talks between the two delegations in Saudi Arabia? Was it positive? Do you think that Donald Trump is doing the way that he's implementing these sort of talks is favorable for is benefiting the United States in a long run?
I thought the talks appeared to be very professional. They were focused, it seems, on the issues that matter, which are the issue of the status of Ukraine in European security, the rights of the Russian speakers in Ukraine, which Mr. Lavrov clearly raised quite forcefully, both before the meeting and obviously during it. And finally, the broader issue of a peace between Russia and the United States, and between Russia and the rest of Europe, that would enable both economic and geopolitical cooperation. So I think they were talking about the right things. And the fact that they agreed basically on several points, that these should be the subjects of discussion, that there should be regular dialogue between the foreign ministers, the Secretary of State and the Foreign Minister of the Russian Federation, that they would appoint negotiating teams on both sides to explore these issues, and that finally, once the parameters for a broad negotiation had been set, they would be open to the participation of Ukraine and the rest of other Europeans. Now, the Europeans, of course, feel left out. But of course, I think in all fairness, one has to say they have put forward no peace proposal at all. There's no evidence they have any agreement at all among themselves about what should be done. There are 27 members of the European Union. They can't make any decisions any more than any other 27 people can, or if they do make a decision, it's due to the lowest common denominator. We've seen two efforts now by Macron, the president of France, to assemble smaller groups of Europeans to see if he can't reach some kind of consensus that would enable a decision. There's been no decision. They have labored mightily and brought forward nothing. So the question really arises, why hasn't the European Union, why haven't European unions put forward any kind of peace initiative? What they've been talking about is exactly the wrong thing, and that is strengthening the military balance against Russia. They talk about, having peacekeeping troops in Ukraine. They don't have the capability to do that, so it's basically hypothetical, but they talk about this as though this is an answer to something. But it's exactly the presence of hostile forces in Ukraine from the United States and Europe that provoked Russia into this war. So that is not going to fly. That is not going to work. And I think various Russian spokespeople have been very clear about that. So we are left with to wait for the results of whatever process exists between the appointed negotiators for Moscow and Washington to outline a set of broad principles which could entice Europeans to address things. The final two observations. The fecklessness, the lack of efficiency and consequence of European actions has now led Antonio Costa, the president of the European Council, to acknowledge that Europe is very likely going to have to cut a deal with Russia directly about the future European security architecture. This is very important because it basically is recognition that Europe has to declare strategic independence from the United States. The second thing I would note is that there is now a lot of talk, to the extent there is a requirement for peacekeeping troops in some sort of transition in Ukraine, not a permanent presence, but some transition. People are talking about Chinese troops, so this would recognize China as a great world power, which it is, and draw on its neutrality in the Ukraine-Russia struggle. And it would give it a voice in European security, and it would be quite costly to the American aspirations for continued hegemony in Europe.
In reaction to what has happened in Saudi Arabia, we had the first summit in Paris that Emmanuel Macron tried to manage some sort of talks between some European countries, and there's going to be a second summit as well in Paris. But when you look at the behavior of Europeans, do you think without the United States, are they going to be able to manage their sort of policies? Because after all, the way that Donald Trump is behaving toward Europe, there has to be some sort of understanding that the United States is, under Donald Trump at least, is moving out of Europe, is not considering Europe as a great partner for the talks for any sort of, because Ukraine is a huge issue right now for Europe, but Donald Trump is not considering them to talk because he says they don't have any sort of plan, as you mentioned. But how do you find Europeans themselves? Are they trying to help themselves?
Not very much. I think the first summit that I referred to, the effort by Macron to hold 2 summits of limited European partners to discuss what is to be done. And, the first summit had the Germans saying we should not put any troops into Ukraine, absolutely not. The British promising they would, and then saying they only would if the United States would join them, which we won't. That's not US policy. The French arguing for common European military industrial policies, but then proposing that everybody buy French equipment, So this was an illustration really of why Europe remains much less than the sum of its parts. And the problem for the Europeans is that for 80 years, since the end of World War II, they have depended on the United States to maintain order in Europe. They did that during the Cold War bipolar era, and they've done it in the post-Cold War era. And the effort to expand NATO to include all of Europe, which might have been some sort of move toward continent-wide cooperative security, was not. It was a move to expand the American sphere of influence, even to the borders of Russia. Russia rejected that. And I think the lessons of history are quite clear. And I've mentioned this before, I don't want to bore you, but I think the only way that Europe can enjoy stability and peace is with the inclusion of all great European powers. And Russia is a great European power. And we saw in the Congress of Vienna in 1815, the resulting Concert of Europe, in which the French, who had torn Europe apart under Napoleon and their revolution before that, were reintegrated into the councils of European security. And the result was pretty much a century of limited conflict, almost very little conflict. And this was the mistake was in I'm sorry, that example was not followed after the end of World War I. Basically, Germany and Russia were excommunicated from European councils, and the result was the rise of fascism, communism taking over in Eastern Europe. I mean, both of World War II and the subsequent Cold War. So we should learn from all this. Europe needs to have its own order among its great powers. Now, the United States can play a very important supplementary role there, but we really can't do that for the Europeans. And if you listened at all to what was said by American representatives the authorities, the vice president, the Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of State, in connection with the Munich Security Conference. What they said basically is the United States is shifting its attention from Europe to the Pacific. And you Europeans have got to learn how to manage your own affairs. Now, can the Europeans do that? They're going to have to, but there's no evidence to date that they know how. 80 years is a long time. Perhaps they've forgotten how to take the initiative, make decisions, manage their own affairs, and exercise an independent, important role in global affairs. I guess, everybody, including, well, certainly myself, and I think many Americans would very much welcome Europe taking charge of its own destiny. 80 years is a long time for Americans to be responsible for the affairs of another continent. Countries like China, like Russia, like India, like Brazil, your own country, would very much welcome a multinodal order, a world order in which there were many participants. Connections existed between all of the great and middle-sized and smaller powers, and in which there were agreed principles for conducting international relationships. All of that is gone at the moment. There's no respect for the United Nations Charter, international law. We are back in the sort of lawless condition that Thucydides described in the Melian dialogue. The strong do what they can, and the weak suffer what they must. This is not a satisfactory world order for anybody. So the key to changing it in many ways is how the war in Ukraine ends and whether it leads to a new European security architecture in which the neutrality of Ukraine and Ukraine's role as a bridge and a buffer between East and West is central. Can we do that? Can the United States bring itself to accept that? Can Europeans take the initiative to produce that result? We don't know.
British Prime Minister Starmer is talking about he's going to be in Washington talking with Donald Trump in order to convince him, or to, I don't know if he has any sort of leverage on Donald Trump, but to talk with Donald Trump in order to put British or European troops on the ground in Ukraine in the aftermath of any sort of Ukrainian settlement. Here is the question. When you talk about the independence of Europe, how do you see the role of the British government or the British policies in terms of, are they trying to help Europeans to be more independent, or the way that they're behaving and the history they have is just putting Europe in a weaker position?
Well, I have to say, and I say this with regret, that Charles de Gaulle, the great president of France, who was very much suspicious of the British and believed that they were a stalking horse for American influence in Europe, not committed to Europe, has proven right. That's what Brexit proved. Brexit diminished Europe, diminished not Europe, but Britain. Europe is more cohesive, not much, but more cohesive without Britain. And, when Macron holds a summit in Paris to talk about the future of Europe in relation to Ukraine and other issues, he has to involve the British. They come there, but you see Keir Starmer running off to Washington. And this illustrates the fact that having diminished its voice in European affairs, the British have become obsessed with sustaining what remains of their special relationship with Washington. I think this is, and I've said this before, like the Lone Ranger in Tonto, his faithful Indian companion. Tonto, of course, means stupid in Spanish, but that's neither here nor there. Tonto is a character only because he has a relationship with the Lone Ranger. Well, the Lone Ranger is, very grateful for Tonto's help. but doesn't pay too much attention to Tonto. So this is the sort of relationship we have now. What is left of the so-called special relationship is very little. And you asked, does Sir Keir Starmer have leverage on Mr. Trump? No, he doesn't. And he doesn't have the capacity to put troops in Ukraine anyway. This is an empty gesture intended to please the United States, but it doesn't please the United States because Mr. Trump and his administration understand that this is not a path to peace, but to continued warfare with the Russians. They will not accept a hostile force of any kind in Ukraine. They might accept, as I mentioned earlier, some kind of force from the global south, maybe Brazilians along with Chinese, to manage a transition to peace. But they're not going to accept NATO either a la carte or as a whole.
Ambassador, before wrapping up this session, I know that your time is limited today. How do you see the positive things of the new administration and the negative ones? How did you find the Trump administration?
Well, there's a saying by Chairman Mao Zedong, who probably, if you can't destroy things, if you don't destroy things, you can't rebuild them. The Trump administration is destroying a lot of things. The technique that Mr. Trump seems to prefer is to use the sledgehammer to do brain surgery, which is a very unusual technique, and then to see what emerges from whatever smithereens have been established by this approach. And potentially this is, if you think of, well, you're an engineer, so if I tell you, years ago, the Corning Glass Company engineered a supposedly indestructible set of china dinnerware. And I can remember saying to my grandmother, who was quite skeptical about this, you see, this is indestructible. I can throw it on the floor and it won't break. And I threw it and it didn't break. And then I picked it up, threw it again, and it exploded. Why? Because internal tensions in this piece of porcelain glass were latent, and if you subjected it to stress, it would blow up. Well, this is a common thing that you study in engineering, internal stress. There's huge internal stress in the global system at present. Mr. Trump is blowing it up. Is this going to prove good or bad? I don't know. But it is certainly producing a lot of change, and some of it seems very necessary. We've been talking about the need for Europe to become something more than it is. Europe is at a moment, to use an analogy from U.S. history, like our Articles of Confederation. That was the first constitution we had after we persuaded the British that we should be independent, which we had to fight to do. It wasn't a very good constitution. It was too weak. Much like European Union, it's too weak. We had 13 states. They couldn't make up their minds about anything. 27 states are even worse. Europeans are going to have to come up with some more effective mechanism of reaching Europe-wide conclusions and enabling Europe to act as something more than the independent sum of its parts. Whether they're up to that or not, we don't know. Clearly, we are confronting a world in which, as I've said, middle-ranking powers like Saudi Arabia or Turkey, or arguably Indonesia, and rising powers like Indonesia are exercising a great deal more influence. And that seems to be the future. But what are the rules of the game? We've thrown out the post-World War II rules, which were the UN Charter and international law. What are we going to replace them with? All these issues have become very topical as a result of Mr. Trump's use of a sledgehammer. I think that's actually potentially positive.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Ambassador, for being with us today. Great pleasure as always.
Thank you, Nima.